Welcome back to the channel, guys. Today we're going to talk about the recent Bud Light controversy. We're going to talk about how we've got here in history. We're going to talk about kind of the liberal conservative perspectives and the pendulum that swings back and forth, and how we have these waves of extremes that just keep compounding each other and getting more and more extreme on each side. So we're going to break down how we've got here, where we're going from here, and talk about with historical perspective how we've gotten to this point in history. Firstly, I want to begin by stating that I am neither a liberal nor a conservative. I think politics, like religion and race, are tools used by the elites to keep the lower classes divided. Politics is like a pendulum. It swings both ways, and typically you have waves of sentiment that shift based on who's in power and what cultural narratives are being pushed. In the 1960s, there was a huge liberal backlash against conservatives that lasted for the whole decade. And from Kennedy's civil rights stance to Lyndon Johnson's Great Society programs, combined with social movements like the civil rights and Black Power movements, these liberal policies and movements emerged following decades of conservative control and World War. This is not surprising, as society tends to shift more conservative and to the right during a war, with the exception, of course, of Vietnam. Following the liberal 1960s came the conservative backlash that came in the form of Nixon, who cut almost all social welfare programs, shifted the war of poverty to the war on crime, and the agents of the state effectively neutralized and divided the Black Power and civil rights movements, and began pushing conservative cultural narratives, such as law and order, that was the antithesis to civil rights. This conservative backlash was able to take control of American society for over 3 decades, until the 1990s, when Clinton came to power. Interestingly enough, Clinton ran as a Democrat, but his campaign relied heavily on law and order messages that enabled him to finally take political control back from the Republicans. Clinton was progressive in some ways, but overall did little to push liberalism, and by 2001, Bush was back in office, and another war society back to the conservative corner. Then Obama happened, and this was the liberal backlash that finally began to push the pendulum back to the left. Similar to with Vietnam, many Americans protested the war in Iraq. Both left and right were hesitant to condemn or condone the war, but after a while, many began to see it as a failed campaign, and the left pushed anti-war and anti-Bush propaganda that challenged state narratives. This is where the true liberal shift began. Many questioned why certain groups like Halliburton, ran by conservatives, made billions of dollars in the war. From hip-hop to Noam Chomsky and Democracy Now!, the criticism against the war blasted oil companies as neo-colonizers. They claimed that conservative corporate groups were using weapons of mass destruction to convince Americans to back the development of Middle Eastern oil production and build pipelines throughout Afghanistan and Iraq. These anti-conservative sentiments brought many people to the liberal side and made them question how much of the truth they were actually being told and how much people in power actually cared about them. Obama easily won the election in 2008 because he knew how much Americans truly distrusted Bush and his neocon cabal of corporate colonialists. Obama represented change, just as his campaign slogan stated. This was no coincidence. Obama knew that if he could convince even a few conservatives to back him, he would win, because Americans were simply fed up with war and the neocon policies. Obama had to suffer through the aftermath of the 2008 economic crash that was the result of aggressive housing loans enabled by a lack of regulations on Wall Street and in corporate banks. These policies were enabled by Reaganomics, but had grown exponentially due to the unwillingness of politicians and economists to regulate big banks. Obama enabled liberalism to flourish due to his policies and his demeanor. Being the first black president enabled black society to gain more political and social power than they had ever had, while hip-hop and pop culture began to represent liberal shifts such as the empowerment of women, the acceptance of Muslims as not being synonymous with terrorism, as well as gay rights, that all began to become more prominent as the pendulum shifted more and more to the left. Now, it is easy to understand how and why society would shift to the left with a liberal government, yet the sheer speed and influence these waves were able to achieve is quite astounding. What is important here is to view these moves like a teeter-totter, which is a child's toy that has one kid on each side of the toy and they rock back and forth with one kid being in the air and the other kid being on the ground. As the momentum moves to the other side, the kid that was on the ground will now be in the air and the other kid will now be on the ground. This is a pendulum swinging back and forth, and as one side enters the extreme, it usually hits resistance and needs to pull back. Or if it does not pull back, a violent reaction from the opposite side will force the pendulum to swing back in the other direction. This was how Trump rose to power, and it was quite obvious at the time he was going to win, and why. I even wrote a paper titled The Rise of Trump Mania, where I discussed why he would win and how a conservative backlash would push society towards civil war and create a new alt-right. Trump was more a product of the time than of his own character. If Trump ran for office in 2008, he would have lost. He needed society to shift liberal and for Obama to embolden the left to agitate conservative groups to push them back to the far right, as many had questioned their backing of Bush during the war and the rise of the economic crisis. But Obama, who really didn't push any specific anti-conservative policies, did enable civil rights and brought economic policies and regulations that sought to rein in corporate powers and prevent another economic collapse. Trump wasn't a bad president, and I don't even know if he truly believed half of the positive heuristic rhetoric that he used to gain and maintain power. He simply said what he thought certain groups he needed support from wanted to hear, and he got their support. This is what politicians do. They know how to appease extremists by appearing to cater to their narratives. Whether they believe them or not is another question. The thing with Trump is that his presidency pushed the pendulum so far right so fast, and as we have discussed, this was directly after and in opposition to liberal control of cultural narratives. When the pendulum shifts so quickly in one direction, it must move the other way with equal or greater force. This is the law of gravity. The extreme liberalism in society we see today stems as a direct reaction from the extremist right-wing policies we saw under Trump and Bush before him. The politicians and corporations, in an attempt to maintain support, cater to the extremes in society and attempt to simply follow the trend. Trend seems liberal. They support diversity and inclusion. When it is conservative, they back military, education, and corporate groups. It is all a show, and no elite gives a damn about the gay community or the nuclear family. Politics is a game meant to keep both sides divided and ignorant, to ensure the same elites control society regardless of who is in the White House. Joe Biden is probably one of the most uninteresting presidents you could ever have asked for. Yet, the society that we have today shifted so far to the left, it has reached a climax, and now we sit at what could be a very important time in American history. There is a very real possibility that there will be a civil war coming between the far right and the far left. This happens when the pendulum breaks and there is no longer consensus and shared values. When the pendulum swings with violent speeds and suddenly collapses, there is generally conflict before reestablishing the pendulum. If society slowly swings to the center and both groups are able to take a deep breath and reevaluate their values, there is a possibility we can save the pendulum from crashing and bring a more centrist government and society. The problem is, in our TikTok and Twitter-driven world, it is the extremes that gain the most views because the shock value and clickbait thumbnails draw inconceivable amounts of supporters that become more loyal to influencers than they are to themselves. We need critical thinkers. We need social scientists and historians like me that can zoom out and say, hey, these are pretty obvious trends to follow, and this is how they will most likely play out.